Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, bienvenidos de nuevo. Welcome back to Colombia. You were here in 2017 as part of the delegation with President Higgins. Now, diplomatic relations have obviously improved substantially since 2017. We have the embassy here, which you officially opened on Monday. We're recording this on St. Patrick's Day, and Colombia has an embassy in Dublin. You are now Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. Would it be fair to say, though, from a trade perspective, both Colombia and Ireland would view each other as small fry? And what have you seen in these last few years and now during this visit since Monday that you've been here in terms of where maybe we can grow, the opportunities for advancement?
Muchas gracias y feliz Día de San Patricio. Really pleased to be here in Colombia and earlier in Chile representing Ireland for the St. Patrick's Day ministerial missions. As you said, was here first with President Higgins back in 2017. And really in the past 5 years there has been a very strong deepening of relations between Colombia and Ireland. They've opened their embassy in Dublin, we've opened our embassy here in Colombia. And part of what I did when I was Taoiseach was set out in Global Ireland 2025 that we would double our influence and global footprint, and part of that was opening new embassies in Santiago in Chile and Bogota here in Colombia. So it's a privilege and an honour to be allowed to do those official openings. And I am here, of course, as Tánaiste, as well as Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So it's covering the full range of government interests, not just trade issues. Trade between Ireland and Colombia, as you say, is small. But it's not negligible. It's about 130 million in goods and about 300 million in services. And we do think there's a lot of scope for expansion. So just to give you an example of two companies that are Irish that are operating here, Smurfit Kappa employs over 3,000 people here in packaging. Declan Ryan's Viva Air is the main low-cost airline, if you like, here in Colombia, and Mainstream Power is very involved in harnessing renewable resources here, and then a lot of companies in fintech and health tech as well. So definitely we're coming off a relatively low base, but I think the potential is very large, not just in trade, but also in areas like education, for example.
Yeah, education. You signed a memorandum of understanding, I believe, with the Minister for Education here in Colombia. So what exactly is that about? We're going to see various kind of programs between universities here in Colombia and Ireland. What is the scope of that?
Yeah, so there's a memorandum of understanding we now have between the Ministries of Higher Education in Ireland and Colombia, and also Universidad dos Andes has a Irish Studies program, and I was delighted to meet the students participating in that program today and speak to them. And they now have a partnership both with the University of Limerick and with Trinity College. So, these things are starting to happen. What I'd love to see is more Colombian students coming to Ireland to study in our universities, to learn English, to work if they want to. We have a lot of Brazilian students, for example, in Ireland, which people would know, maybe not so many from Colombia, even though it has a population of more than 50 million people, and also would like to see more collaboration between Irish universities and some really high quality education institutions here in Colombia. So the MOU that we signed really is the framework that allows us to do that. I think one area where we can do better in Ireland is on visas. Colombians need a visa to come to Ireland, have to pay for that visa. That's not the case from a lot of other countries in Latin America, so that's something I'll try and improve or change, and have been in contact with Minister McEntee about that already.
Well, I can tick that one off the list of questions that I was going to ask you, because I have to say the Irish community here, it is one. Now, we were talking off air, I'm single, but a lot of my friends who have Colombian partners or whatever are just friends, and I have a lot of friends who are interested in going to Ireland, and that is an issue. Of course, we are part of the EU. I have to say, President Higgins said in 2017 that Ireland could be a bridge to Europe for Colombians, but the reality is it's kind of more of a barrier because we're not part of the Schengen. Could we be part of the Schengen, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, I would love Ireland to be part of the Schengen Agreement, but the reason why we're not is for a very good reason, and that's because the United Kingdom is not, and we have a common travel area with the UK. So if we were to join the Schengen area, we would have passport checks between Britain and the United Kingdom, and while that might be okay at airports and ports where de facto those checks exist already, it would potentially mean checks on people travelling between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that's not something we could ever countenance. So that's the reason why we can't join Schengen. It's like a lot of things that we would like to do when it comes to European integration. We have to bear in mind the fact that our country is partitioned, and part of Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, and we have to take that into account.
Am I right in saying, though, your ancestral home in China, that if you have a visa for the UK and vice versa, Chinese and Indians can travel? So could there be something like that as well worked into it?
Well, the visa waiver scheme is already in place. So if you're Colombian and you have a UK visa, if you go to the UK, you can then come on to Ireland. But it's still a barrier, as you say, and things are a little bit better. Certainly the Colombian and Irish people I've met here have said to me it's much easier now there's an embassy in Bogota than when they had to send passports to our embassy in Mexico City. But what I'd like really is to get to the point where there's no charges, where a UK visa would work in Ireland and the UK, and we have a system for doing that. But ideally get to the point that we have with other countries in Latin America, where there's no visa required at all. If you're coming to the country for 90 days, you don't need a visa. That has facilitated, very close contacts between Argentina and Brazil, and Chile and Mexico and Ireland. And the fact we have quite strict rules with respect to Colombia probably dates back to security issues of the past that aren't as significant now. But again, it's something I'll have to speak to the Department of Justice about and the Department of Foreign Affairs when I get home.
Well, okay. Well, we'll keep you to your word on that one there, Tánaiste, because it is an important one for the Irish community. Speaking of the embassy here, if I'm not mistaken, there is a Garda Attaché here, but is that the first ever Garda Attaché in any embassy? And what are we to read into that it's here in Colombia? Obviously, we talked about trade relations, memorandum of understanding in education, but also when we talk about Colombia, there is the drugs trade that we have to keep in mind. And I know you've been on the record coming out strong against the Kinahan cartel. With this Garda Attaché here, is this a sign that Ireland is upping the ante in terms of surveillance on these international cartels, or is it just more coincidental?
Well, it's not the case. It's the only place in the world that we have Garda Attaché. We have a number around the world. Okay. I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly where, but I know Paris, France is one of them, for example.
First here in Latin America.
The first in Latin America, but that I'm aware of. It may be the case that there are others, but it's not a reflection on Colombia by any means that we have a Garda Attaché here. We have it in a number of countries, and it just allows for police cooperation. And I signed an MOU here in Colombia on behalf of Commissioner Drew Harris to facilitate further cooperation. And it is the case that Colombia is a source of narcotics, and some come into Ireland and through Ireland, but it allows our Gardaí to work with the police here, but it also can work on a very practical level too. All over the world, Irish citizens sometimes are victims of crime, and having a Garda presence here can really help them if that happens, and vice versa.
Okay. You met with President Duque yesterday, I believe. Was drugs an issue there? Because his predecessor, Juan Manuel Santos, talked about the need to change the course in the, in inverted commas, war on drugs. What are your thoughts on that? I think Duque would have a particularly different line from President Santos. Do you think we need a different approach to the war on drugs?
Well, to be honest, that wasn't a very major topic of discussion. We met for an hour, and it was great to have that level of access with President Duque. And a number of ministers attended that breakfast too. We did talk about it in the context of the peace agreement, but not in any particular detail. And I suppose it's not really my role here to tell the Colombian government what they should do in terms of their internal affairs, but did obviously want to talk about the full implementation of the peace agreement, the need to observe things like human rights, for example. Did express the concern that over 300 people have been killed since the peace accords were signed, but renewed Ireland's commitment to helping out in any way we can, and we do that in a number of ways. So one of the things I had the pleasure to visit, or the privilege to visit, was a demining project near Cali, where the Irish government is helping to fund a demining project which is allowing people to return to their lands.
Okay. Just in general, though, I know not specifically in Colombia, but your thoughts on the war on drugs, though, because it is obviously a global issue. Do you think it's the right approach, or would you think legalization in certain context might be a better approach?
During the last government, we appointed a group to examine that under Justice Gareth Sheehan, I think it was, and his advice was that we not go down that route. I know that they have in Portugal, and the Oireachtas Committee, Joint Oireachtas Committee, recommended that we should do that. The commission, which was established in the last government, recommended that we not. And I know what the Taoiseach has now said is that we intend to do a citizens' assembly on the issue of drugs and how best to deal with it. And we'd hope to do that we'd expect to certainly have that done during the course of this government, but I don't really want to prejudice the outcome of that now.
Okay. Just zooming out then from local affairs here, we'll say in Colombia and to the region in general. You, as you mentioned, were in Chile. You were at the inauguration of the new president there, Gabriel Boric, and I believe you met with other Latin American leaders. And one of the issues was trying to persuade countries here to follow the EU's line on sanctions. How were you met when you mentioned that to them? And I guess some people back home are wondering, well, why has Tánaiste decided to take this upon himself to encourage Latin American countries to follow an EU line when we are neutral militarily anyway, perhaps not politically?
Well, I suppose I was very fortunate that the St. Patrick's Day visits coincided with the inauguration of the new president in Chile, and because I was the only, the King of Spain was there, but he's a monarch, obviously, and I'm not. I'm a deputy prime minister. So I was asked by the European Union to be the European Union's representative at the inauguration, which meant that I had an opportunity to meet with President Boric formally, but also to meet with outgoing President Piñera and then the Vice President of Brazil and the Presidents of Ecuador and Uruguay and Peru as well. So it was a really good opportunity. If you tried to organise those meetings, it might have taken weeks or months to organise. And it was an opportunity for me to put across that message from the European Union that we are asking the democratic world to stand together. Latin American governments, ranging from those on the right in Colombia to those on the left in Chile, have been very clear that they're joining us in our opposition to what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine. Their statements have been extremely clear, and we really welcome that. But we're asking them to back that up by joining America, Europe, and the democracies of East Asia in imposing sanctions on Russia too, and that message was certainly heard. And I certainly think that here in Colombia, President Duque wants to do that, but will need congressional approval, and that's something that he'll have to obviously work on. I suppose the exceptions in this region would be Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, but no surprise, those countries are not really democracies. Oppress their own people and, like the Russians, recruit people in the West to say that ain't so. So it's not surprising they're supporting Russia, but they are the exceptions, I think, in Latin America.
Yeah, a couple of things there. I do want to touch on Venezuela, but I might get to that in a second. It's just, obviously the last few years now, every generation I think thinks that their political leaders or how it's been run in democratic countries think that whatever their leaders are working against them, etc. But on the day that you landed in Colombia, we had 15,000 tons of Russian diesel landing in Dublin. So if we ask low income, middle income countries, the developed world in inverted commas, to take on these sanctions, they perhaps will get a bloodier nose than the likes of Ireland and high income nations in Europe. And then they will see, well, what kind of... Okay, there are sanctions, obviously, and they're very strict sanctions, but to a point, we're still importing what we need from Russia. So people might think, well, it's do as I say, not as I do.
Well, the sanctions that we've imposed on Russia are the strictest sanctions that have ever been imposed in a very long time anyway, probably going back to South Africa and apartheid. That's the last time you would have had sanctions, economic and political, on this level in my recollection. And that will impact very heavily on a lot of European economies, particularly those near Russia, like Germany, for example, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that are very dependent on Russian gas and trade with Russia. So we'll be much more affected than the United States and Latin America will be. But we think it's necessary because we have to say that this is not the kind of thing that we can tolerate in the 21st century as an international community. Ironically, now that we're no longer accepting Russian coal in Money Point to power our power station there, the coal is actually coming from Colombia. So ironically, that's an example of where Russian products may even be displaced by products from Latin America, but there's no denying that the sanctions will have an impact on the countries that choose to impose them, but we're doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it for humanitarian reasons, and we're doing it because we have to say that this can't happen in the 21st century.
A couple of things again on that. Number one, you saw rapprochement from the White House to Maduro, and you mentioned Venezuela. Again, not a democratic country, and also Saudi Arabia. Its record on human rights is shocking. So we kind of go, well, we're imposing these sanctions. Obviously, Russia is in a war, a hot war, but these other countries that the West are cozying up to now in an emergency don't exactly have a brilliant track record in terms of human rights.
Well, that's correct, but I don't think we should misunderstand the situation that's happening here. What's happening in Russia is a dictatorship is trying to take over another country, depose its democratically elected government, impose a puppet government, annex part of it. They already have annexed part of it, and occupy more of it. That is on a different level to what we're seeing happening in Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. That doesn't justify what's happening there by any means. We need a return to democracy in Venezuela. We need vast improvements on human rights in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for example. But I don't accept this view that because human rights are violated in too many countries in the world, that it's somehow okay for us not to see that what's happening in Ukraine is on a different level. This is not the kind of thing we've seen in Europe since the 1930s or 1940s, and we must say that this can't happen in the 21st century.
Okay, I know we're against the clock, but just briefly, in the media, and we're seeing this in I think driven by a lot of the legacy media, to use that term, that kind of everything Russian now is evil. We've seen, I think, a university in Milan banning Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky not being played in certain places. Like, there is a danger, and as Irish people, I think we have to be aware of that. Do you think that, okay, if you have some criminal elements in your country, and in Russia's case it is their leader, but not all Russians are evil, but that element seems to be coming through in certain reporting.
Well, I think we have to make the distinction between President Putin and his government and the Russian people. And what I've seen is some extraordinary bravery by Russian people. You know, I saw the editor working in the TV station who protested on television. We've seen people protest in St. Petersburg and Moscow against the war. These are extremely brave people, and I think it is important that we make a distinction between Russians and the Russian people and what the Russian government is doing. But unfortunately, it's never going to be possible to impose sanctions on a country that doesn't affect all of its people. So I think everyone would support the fact that sanctions were imposed on South Africa during apartheid, even though that hurt black people and Indian people economically as well. But these things are necessary.
Okay. Just one final question. I'm going to bring it back to Colombia. A presidential election coming up here in May, pretty crucial. If we're to believe the polls, and I think neither of us are in a position that we believe polls anymore, and certainly not in this country as well, and we know what they're like in Europe. But it looks like Colombia might head to have a leftist president for the first time in its history. Again, you mentioned Venezuela, so that might smooth the relations with the Maduro regime or government, whatever you want to call it. But it wouldn't go down too well, I'm guessing, in Washington. You're from a party that's, in an Irish context, centre-right. What would you think if Colombia does decide to go on a leftist route with a former guerrilla as president, almost like, and I don't think you'd like this, Jerry Adams' Taoiseach, it could be said?
Well, firstly, there's one thing I know about opinion polls is they don't predict the outcome of elections, so we'll have to see what happens when the elections happen here. But Colombia is a democracy. It's a matter for the people in this country to decide who their president is, and whoever the people of Colombia decide to elect as their president, we will try and work with. And, I've come from Chile, where a radical left president has been elected. President Boric was very pleased to be the first EU leader, deputy prime minister, to meet with him and to hear a bit from him about his plans, and potentially he represents a new generation of left-wing leaders in South America. Even though he comes from the student protests, from the radical left, he has been very clear on Venezuela and Nicaragua, and to a certain extent that gives me some encouragement that just because a country elects a radical left leader doesn't mean they have to go down the route of Venezuela and Cuba. In fact, he's been very, very critical of what's happened there and doesn't want to bring his country in that direction. But, we'll have to see. But ultimately, democracy means accepting the result, and it's not our business to tell Colombians who they should elect, and we'll work with any democratically elected government that we can.
Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, thank you very much for your time. We'll go and enjoy the St. Patrick's festivities.